There you go. All right, we're recording now. All right, so basically the way this is gonna work out, I kind of made like this visual for you guys so that you guys can kind of like follow along as I'm going through it. Basically, we have, so formalities like the goals and guidelines and our hopes for this Bible study. So a little bit, what are we trying to accomplish with this Bible study? What is it gonna look like? Kind of like that. And then we're gonna talk about like why First Samuel. And kind of like the reason behind that. How we'll be studying the book of Samuel, and also is kind of like the overarching theme of First Samuel as well. And you'll kind of see that it's broken into 4 different parts, and those parts kind of follow along with some of the characters. And then we'll have the actual introduction to First Samuel, and we're not going to be studying necessarily the first 5 chapters, although that will be the reading for next week, but we will get an introduction of some of the important characters. So we're going to see, Saul, we're going to see David, we're going to see Samuel. Samuel obviously is important because he's, it's the name of the book. And then we're also going to find some historical context, so that you're not confused of where they're at in time, right? And then we're gonna be talking about another sort of thing, which is called, I guess we'll start calling like our subtopics. So kind of as an idea or supporting to our Bible studies, we'll be having a topic that maybe, as you guys are growing in your faith, it's a little bit of knowledge that I am able to share to you. Being a Christian for 9 years now, and then obviously I've been growing up in the church before then, and then having led a Bible study group before, and then also being taught by mentors, maybe some of that knowledge can be passed on to you, and that's hopefully some of the subtopics. So for today, it's going to be the topic of God-fearing and what that means, and then we maybe or may not, depending on time, get into just a brief description of the first 5 chapters. So let's get our way. So some of the goals and guidelines we have for pretty much this Bible study is, well, first of all, we want you guys to share. We don't want you guys to feel like you're not able to give, your own sort of comments, your own sort of beliefs about, what we might be reading. Our, I guess, like way of teaching this isn't going to be too, it's not going to be like an apologetic study where you're going to be tested on the nitty gritty of every single verse and every single topic, right? It's just going to be a more general version of the book of the first book and second book of Samuel, and hopefully you'll get some clues as to what they're talking about. And then actually one of those clues comes from the first chapter, and the first couple chapters of the book of Samuel. So it's pretty interesting how they lay it out, but also, but yeah, I don't want it. Sorry, I'm getting a little bit tangent. This is not a class, but it might kind of seem like it because I can talk a lot, and I know that, but I'm also just really excited to teach you something because this is a topic that I love to teach about. It's just something that I feel comfortable doing, and I want you guys to kind of understand. And I put a little point here, but I want you guys also to have a desire to read First Samuel as we're going through it. You might come, 1 week and then, not have done the reading, and that's probably okay because I can probably give enough context for you to kind of understand like where we're heading at in the direction. But that being said, there is a level of expectation and also desire that you should have, if you really want to be a part of this. And at the same time, I also want to make this pretty fast paced and interesting so that you guys are not like grudging to come back next week, or just having like a second thought about joining and continuing the group. And at the same time, although this is not like a class, there will probably be topics that you guys won't understand. A lot of First Samuel and Second Samuel it contains a lot of history. So if you guys are, confused about where we're at in the story, or, what is the tradition that they have during that time, um, you might have a question. You can ask those questions because more than likely, I can do more research into those topics and I'll probably find an answer. Um, and at the same time, there's no judgment that comes from this Bible study. Of course, we're not going to like judge you because you don't know a verse. It's like it's not Sunday school or anything, so we're not expecting you to memorize verses or anything. Um, and then, personally, my hope is that you can identify a trait or characteristics that you might not have realized is actually biblical. And so for example, like God fearing, like the topic of fear and being kind of like a godly man, they might not in your head align. So it's kind of interesting how there are some traits in the Bible that are almost contrary to what we see in our day to day. And then lastly, we just want you to be interested. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. So why First Samuel? Well, it was kind of random. It wasn't. I mean, it was a little bit. It was a little bit, and was not. When we were coming up with this topic, we did have a list of other Bibles that we had in mind that we wanted to talk about. But I just felt, I don't know, a little bit guided towards First Samuel because um, because it carries a lot of characters who deal with great examples of being a godly man. And so this being a men's Bible study, it just made so much sense to me that we'd study men in the Bible, specifically First Samuel and Second Samuel, who carry these sort of examples. At the same time, just like how we're sinful in nature, these men are also sinful in nature. So we'll see how they also fall a little bit from their faith, but ultimately repent and become or still righteous in God's eyes. Um, and then also with these characters, they carry a weight throughout the Bible. So you might realize that, or you might hear or read in the New Testament a reference to these characters from the Old Testament. So it was also important to study these characters um, because they make more sense when you read them in the New Testament as well. And there's also, First Samuel and Second Samuel have a unique, um, I would say, a message that comes with it. Me and Carlos kind of studied that there, there's actually a message that summarizes almost like the purpose of the book of the Bible. And so we'll actually read that a little bit more towards the end of, First Samuel. So let's jump into some of the important characters. So like I mentioned before, there are three main characters in First and Second Samuel, but there's also a bunch of important notable characters in First Samuel as well. And I don't want to jump into Second Samuel just yet because that's still a ways away. But kind of like the story arc or the three main characters is Samuel, Saul, and David. So it makes sense, to talk about who these characters are. If not everybody knows who Samuel is, though you might have heard his name, you might not have known that he was a prophet, right? Which is also a little bit of his context. So Samuel was a prophet. He has a unique introduction to the Lord. He actually didn't know who the Lord was when he was first communicated to. But we see that Samuel, also the son of Hannah, who I have there as an notable character, grows up to be a prophet and supports Saul's reign as king of Israel. And so I'll jump to Hannah specifically just because she kind of correlates with Samuel's story. So Hannah, I believe, like I put her down as one of the notable characters, is because she kind of takes up some chapters. She takes up kind of like the first three chapters of First Samuel, which is pretty notable. And basically, besides her being the mother of Samuel, she has a poem that she sort of sings, and this poem actually has symbolism for the rest of First and Second Samuel. And some might even say that her poem kind of carries weight for the rest of the Bible as well. So one of those examples is that in her song, and we'll get it a little bit more, and we'll talk a little bit more when we get there next week, is that God will raise up a messianic king, which is kind of crazy when you think about it, because this is the Old Testament, right? This is thousands of years, yeah, at least, yeah, thousands of years before um, Jesus really enters into the picture. So the fact that she's already singing about a king that will eventually come, it's a little bit, it's kind of crazy. As well, she also sings about, um, although despite human evil, God is still at work. It's I would say that is one of the important, I guess, messages that you will be reading more as we get into First Samuel, as well as God opposes the proud and exalts the humble. Um, I would say that is also a highlight, because as men we should be humble as well, and so that might be a characteristic um, that you might resonate with as we're going through this. Saul is kind of like our next big three characters. Um, I I kind of want to keep him a little bit more mysterious, just because he does play such a large figure. But at the same time, it is important to note that he is the first king of Israel, and I'll kind of I'll talk about him a little bit later, because he does kind of fall into the way Israel became a nation. But yeah, I mean, Saul, he's known to be a very handsome man, and he rose to being a king because the people wanted one. And so God said to Samuel, "Let there be a king." So a little bit notable how of Saul and his importance. He is also the same person who is the father-in-law of David, our next big main character. Um, Not everybody, but a lot of people do know David as the story of David and Goliath. That is the same David that we are talking about here. And um, again, we'll learn more and more about him, especially in Second Samuel. But his story and Saul's story kind of overlap in a unique way, that Saul actually wanted to kill David. And so that is a little bit interesting as we're going through the story. Some of the other important notable characters in First Samuel, especially in the next 5 chapters that we'll be reading. So you'll see the Philistines and Israel. If you don't know who the Philistines are, you can think of them kind of as the bad guys almost, who opposes Israel from entering into and obtaining, I believe it's Jerusalem. They kind of carry this land, and so we'll kind of see the battle between these two nations. Israel, if you're not already well aware, is regarded as God's chosen people, and so it's also important to note that Jesus comes from these people, and so there's a little bit of a genealogy that comes from this, and it's a little bit important to note as well. You'll also see here the 12 tribes of Abraham. Again, it's a more historical thing to keep a note, but basically, if you were to kind of do an ancestry.com, you might see that all these people kind of come from one guy, and that guy's name is Abram. Also, Abraham, but later changed his name. And basically, the importance of the 12 tribes, and me and Carlos kind of talked about this a little bit later, they are mentioned a little bit throughout First Samuel. And so I didn't really want to explain all of them here in the introduction, just because there is, a lot of them. There's 12. But at the same time, I would say there are some that are more notable than the others. Specifically the Levites. The Levites are known as the priest. Those we will see in First Samuel, and basically they are subject to serving in the church, the tent in which they declare that is holy. And so you'll see those people working mainly around that kind of field. And then I'll move on just because when we get to a new tribe, I might explain more about those tribes. But for the sake of time, I'll talk about our next person, who is Eli. You can also think of him as Samuel's mentor or another figure that was important to Samuel. He has some sons who we can think of as figures against what we would expect to be a godly man, right? We'll talk a little bit later when we're talking about God fearing, the topic of God fearing, that these figures actually go against that. And so Eli, again, just kind of like a supporting character to Samuel. It's a little unique because of Eli's sons and his position. God actually punishes him, and so he dies in a little bit of a fashionable way, and everybody kind of mourns. But it is kind of important to mention him. And then, of course, there's the Ark of the Covenant, which has pretty much its own chapters and how it's being tossed around. And if I were to describe the Ark and the Covenant to someone who has no idea who has any idea what that is, I would say that it is an object, right? We see that the Ark and the Covenant is almost like a chest, and this chest contains the covenant. And so, where does that covenant come from? It comes from the story of Mount Sinai, when Moses was given the 10 Commandments from God. They placed these commandments into the Ark of the Covenant, right? I think there's also some other objects that is put in there, but I would say that those, because they're crafted by the finger of God, that those are probably the most important. We'll see a little bit how the Ark of the Covenant portrays symbolism of God Himself, and then that plays a little bit of importance because you'll see how the Philistines have the Ark of the Covenant, the Israelites have the Ark of the Covenant, and they exploit almost that fact that they have God on their side versus not the other side. So yeah, and then our last figure is Jesse, who is the father of David. Besides the fact of being, the father of David, we'll talk a little bit more about him maybe as we get to that point, but he's not important, I would say, for the first few chapters. And then, yeah. So for the context of First Samuel, I knew I was going to mention some of the characters that we talk about, like Saul, but let's take it back all the way to the 10 Commandments and ultimately what the Promised Land is. So we know that Israel was rescued, right? You have the famous story of them traveling across the river, and they eventually made their way to Mount Sinai. And at this Mount Sinai, I mentioned before that Moses was giving the 10 Commandments. I think he was giving them, I'm sorry, but I haven't read Exodus in kind of a long time, but I'm pretty sure he received them after staying like 40 nights or something like that. It was kind of a ridiculous amount of time before he received them. But we see that in Exodus. So, these are the kind of the books of the Bible that we see before First Samuel. I want you to keep that in mind. And so from Mount Sinai, they traveled to the Promised Land, which is also known as the land of Canaan. They're interchangeable. And the importance of the land of Canaan actually comes from the very first book of the Bible, when in Genesis 12:7, when the Lord appears to Abraham and says, to your offspring or seed, in some other translations, I will give you this land. And he is talking about the land of Canaan. And so we kind of seen this, we see this like repetitive theme over like the first like 5 or 6 books of the Bible, about him repeating over and over again, you will receive this land. I will give you this land to the people, the chosen people, which is eventually like we know them as the Israelites. And so yeah, and do you guys have any questions about like what is the promised land or the Ten Commandments or anything?
So the promised land is Canaan. Is that like that's the same reason where like Jerusalem is, or am I confused?
I don't want to. Don't think it is actually, right?
Um,
I think because it's in modern day.
I think modern day it is Jerusalem,
Modern day Jerusalem.
because this land was originally like inhabited by giants, and basically like the you get the famous story where the people marched around the walls 7 times, and then on the 7th time they blew their horn and the walls fell down, and people were so scared of the power that they had that they ran. And so modern day, I believe it is Jerusalem, because I do know that like a lot of like people do see it as like, that's why it's been like such just like huge like battle, and then like what's the word? There's like a lot of like prophecies that go on in Revelations that talk about Jerusalem and how like it relates to like Israel and stuff like that. And so I do believe modern day it is Jerusalem. But yeah.
Yeah. Something I just kind of thought of off the top of my head. This is before Israel kind of splits geologically from the land of Judah as well. So this area is very, very large on the map. So I just want to keep that in mind. So continuing kind of like the context of where they're at now. So they were exalted from Egypt. They moved to Mount Sinai. Now they're into this land of Canaan, and pretty much we'll see that, you know, I think I did say before that these people, the Israelites, are fighting off, I think, the native Canaanites and the Philistines in order to take Jerusalem, who they are like, that's where they're at right now. And then, you know, but there's a long road before they get there, and that's where a little bit of context is at in, you know, the story of the book of Joshua, where you know, there's a lot of fighting involved in order to get to this and obtain this sort of land. And then of course Judges, where, you know, Israel still falls in the eyes of the Lord. And so he brings these people, most famously Samson, who, you know, brought down an entire building with him. It's the great book. But now here we're at in 1 Samuel, after the chaos of pretty much all of Judges. We're here and ready to learn about this new generation of kings and prophets, which starts off with Saul as the king of Israel. So that is kind of like our introduction to, you know, where we're at in terms of context for 1 Samuel. And then now I think we're going to jump into kind of like our subtopic, because we're going to be reading 1 Samuel, the first 5 chapters next week. And then we'll kind of jump into more about Hannah. I think we'll see a little bit of the Ark of the Covenant. So all this is kind of like preparing us, and so that you're familiar with these terms before we actually read them. And so, yeah, so jumping into our subsection, I wanted, you know, to, you know, since you're here, Jose, I want to ask you, what do you think God-fearing is, or what is the first thing that comes to mind? Are you familiar with the term? Are you not?
Yeah. But I mean, I don't really have a formal definition I've ever heard, but
Mm,
if you ask me, it'd be um, I know someone who like respects God's word and like knows if they go against it that like there's repercussions. I guess like whether
definitely.
like
Mm.
I guess like going on the wrong path and then like yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's actually pretty interesting that you said repercussions, because that is
Mhm,
immediately one of the things that I think of when I think of fear itself too. I'm thinking
mhm,
of the repercussions of a decision that I made,
yeah.
right? One of the first examples I guess that pops into my head is the repercussion of not knowing the Lord when I go to heaven, right? When I stand before God, is He going to say, you know, that He knew me and I'm able to enter in the gates of heaven, or is He going to reject me? And then, the fear of going to hell, right? That
Mhm,
was one. I think I would say that was one of the fears that I have when I think of the word God fearing. Um, at the same time, we know that there is a lot to be said about this topic, and so much so that one of, I would say Christianity's biggest influencers, John Piper, has a
mhm,
really deep interview on this topic. He says that God fearing is needed today, which is interesting because as I was talking about this topic with Carlos, um, I was saying that God fearing, the topic of it, should be needed all the time by anyone as well. And so when we were going through this interview, the interview it's a little bit outdated. It's not quite a decade long, but it was about like 6 years ago or something like that. And a lot of people tend to relate this topic of God fearing to the Old Testament, which makes a lot of sense. If you read Joshua, we see that one of the striking images that strikes fear is when God is with a particular group. He's with the Israelites, I believe, and they are opposed by an army, and God shows Himself almost as a blaze of fire, and that strikes fear into the enemy, right? So that makes sense when people tend to relate this to the Old Testament, but it's actually everywhere. We see that when we think God fearing is in the New Testament. One of the great examples we'll talk about is 1 John 4:18. But before we get there, let's read Proverbs 28:14, which I put here. Blessed is the one who fears the Lord always, but whoever hardens his heart will fall into calamity. So from this verse alone, it's kind of interesting that we see that he says, blessed is the one who fears, right? It's not, I would say, if this were to fall into a sort of like logical thinking, um, if you fear the Lord, shouldn't that be like the opposite? Shouldn't you? Because when you think of fear, that's not necessarily like that's not a love. Might feel like if you fear your dad, right? Are you loving him as well? Because that could be kind of a conflicting feeling. Um, but it's interesting in here because it also seems contrary to that. He says that the one who fears the Lord is also blessed, and as well as whoever hardens his heart will fall into calamity. So there must be more to the topic of God fearing that we might assume there is. So one way in describing God fearing actually comes from an analogy that John Piper gave on um, on this topic. So he gave an example of a child and a large dog, right? Imagine the child is approaching a house and there's a large dog inside the house. The owner opens the door and the dog runs outside, and the child is almost afraid of the dog, right? But the owner recognizes this and he says, don't run away from him. He doesn't really like that, the dog, right? And so this is what John Piper says in response to that. He says that God is a horrifically dangerous to run away from, and we should be terrified to run away from God. But if we stay with Him, His growl is a growl of our protection, not our destruction. So there, again, it's kind of like this contrary, this clash between the fear that we have towards somebody, as well as the like the love that we can have towards them. But I think, he goes on to say a little bit more about this topic, but there is a distinction between, fearing the Lord in a way that turns you away from him, but also the way that we should actually have this sort of fear, which is a fear that turns us towards him, right? So in 1 John 4:18, we see this verse here. There is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear. For fear has to do with punishment, and whoever fears has not been perfected in love. So again, a little bit of an interesting topic on God fearing, and it's not necessarily, I would say, like, this is one of those topics that once you feel it, you sort of get it. It's a little bit hard to describe because as I was describing this to Carlos, and my sort of description of it, similar to how you gave your description before this, I said that it's a sort of feeling of amazement at the same time of trembling, right? You're sort of intrigued, almost like going on a roller coaster for the first time. You're intrigued to go on it, but at the same time, you are terrified.
Yeah.
So that was almost my description of it, but I don't think there's any perfect description on God fearing, but John Piper does a really good job at sort of giving this analogy. Lastly, I want to say that, of course, we've seen these two verses here that kind of show that it is a biblical topic, as well as something you might not expect, but but Jesus himself actually enjoys fearing God. It's something that we see in Isaiah 66, I believe. I don't have it here, but I hope you guys can just trust me when I say that that pretty much summarizes how Jesus enjoys fearing God, which is unique as well, because if we were to imitate Jesus, imitate God, then we should also enjoy fearing God as well. So hopefully this makes sense in the way that you understand it, just even if it's like a little bit more. But one thing that I would say that God-fearing is it's not a cowering fear. You're not running away. I kind of talked about this a little bit earlier, but it is not a fear that would make you run away from the Lord, but it is a fear that makes you run towards him. And then, yeah, I think that's kind of like the last thing I have to say about that topic. For next week, that we're going to be going over 1 Samuel 1 through 5, learning a little bit more about all those characters that I kind of mentioned at the very beginning. We'll be learning about the Ark in the Covenant. We'll be learning about Samuel being born from Hannah. We'll hear a little bit more about Hannah's poem. But yeah, I'm pretty excited for this series that we're going to be going through. Next week is going to be Carlos going through and leading us through that. So I'm excited about that. Cool.
Yeah.
I'm gonna end the video here.
All right. Sick. All right. So, are we supposed to read the first 5 chapters?